Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to Divination Death Witch. I'm your host, Rin. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the history of tarot, which is not as cut and dry as one might think, and some of it might come as quite the surprise if it's not a topic that you've done a deep dive into yourself. When I started reading tarot in 1995, I didn't give any real thought to the history of tarot. I was a teenager after all. My focus was just to sit down with my Rider-Waite-Smith deck and try to memorize the upright and reversed meanings of each of the 78 cards. I was so focused on learning the right way to read the cards because back then the community was much more dogmatic about right and wrong ways to read the tarot. And because of that, it took me some time to begin to question where different symbols and images had come from and to question the assigned meanings of the cards. My questions stemmed a lot from issues I found myself having with the Rider-Waite-Smith concerning certain symbols and meanings that had turned into stumbling blocks in my tarot path. But at that time, I thought I had to just accept things as they were at that time because that was supposedly the right way to read tarot. Now, so many years later, I've discovered that delving into the history of the tarot has given me a better understanding of the art of tarot reading and has truly helped me to evolve, grow, and become a better reader. I've also learned that there is very much not one right way to read the tarot. As you'll see, the right way to read the tarot has changed many times, and thankfully today we know that there are many different yet valid ways to read the tarot and work with this amazing tool. Those first couple of years of my tarot practice, I only knew of the existence of the Rider-Waite-Smith, and the only source of information that I had on the tarot was Waite's Pictorial Key to the Tarot. There have been a lot of myths, misinformation, and bold-faced lies spread when it comes to the history of tarot, and I had to sort through all of that on my journey. But doing so has given me a new understanding and perspective on the tarot, one which I feel makes me a better reader by understanding where tarot has been and what it has been throughout its history. Learning the real history of tarot also explained and helped me get past those early stumbling blocks I had, and maybe this overview of tarot's history can help you to come to a better understanding of tarot and help you to overcome some of the stumbling blocks you may experience in your tarot journey. In those early years of studying, I didn't understand why the Hebrew alphabet was connected to the cards, or how Kabbalah came to be incorporated at all. I had only heard the Egyptian origin theory of the tarot when I was beginning reading tarot. And then eventually I heard the Romani myth, and it was quite some time into my tarot practice before I began to uncover the legitimate history of tarot. When I was first learning, and remember, this was back in the mid-90s, tarot was touted as this super ancient art, or so I had been led to believe, and many others. Many claimed that tarot was so old that it supposedly predated any followers of the Abrahamic faiths being present in Egypt at all, which, even early on, made me ask, so why are there so many Abrahamic symbols in the tarot if it was supposedly so ancient and began in Egypt? This line of questioning, these anachronisms, thankfully, didn't deter me from learning and reading tarot, and luckily I kept at it. Eventually, I discovered different decks and ways of reading and interpreting the cards. I'd also learned the history of tarot. Those stumbling blocks and nagging questions were still there, but I kind of just put them to the side and worked around them in my early years. When I first began reading tarot, it never really occurred to me that I should look into the history of tarot to answer my questions and resolve some of those blockages I was experiencing. I looked forward to try to resolve things by picking up new decks and learning their meanings and styles of reading, and I paid close attention when other readers talked about their meanings for cards and their styles of reading. When I finally found myself looking back at the history of tarot, I started having these aha moments that put things into context, and I realized that there really isn't a right way to read tarot, and that the history of tarot is not what many of us thought. At least what many of us thought back in the 90s when I was first learning to read tarot. Once I started diving into the history of tarot, I remembered something that my Brit Lit teacher had taught us in high school. When we whined about why we were being forced to learn so much history in a lit class, she said, "You can't truly understand a work unless you know the context in which it was written." Meaning that without having the context of what was going on in the author's world, which didn't just mean the author's personal life, but what was going on in the world around them, at the time that they wrote the piece, if you don't have all that context, you're missing layers of meaning from the work. I found this holds true for tarot and all forms of divination as well, really. Understanding where they came from and how they've developed over time, I personally feel really is essential if you want to be the best reader you can be. Now, obviously, that is my opinion. I know good readers who don't know the first thing about the history of tarot, but I tell you all the time that when it comes to spiritual practices, there's always something new to learn and room for growth. And learning the history of tarot is one thing that can help us to grow as readers. I need to give a little disclaimer here before we dive into tarot's historical timeline. I am not a tarot historian. I'm just a tarot reader who one time read a random article going, "Hey, by the way, the whole tarot came from Egypt thing is complete bunk," and that got me started on a path where I started digging into tarot's past. There is so much that we do not know of tarot's history, and trying to research it can be a real bramble patch because there is a lot of bad information out there, but there's also a lot that we do know. I've tried to cross-reference the information I found, and I've tried to use what should be credible and scholarly sources. But that said, we're talking history here, and the truth is, we don't know as much about most things in history as we think we do. I can't guarantee that everything in this episode is 100% accurate, but I have done my best to put together what I feel, from my research, is the most credible information on the subject that we currently have in 2024. There will be some gaps and some speculation on the part of scholars, and I will do my best to point out when something is speculative or has less documentation than other facts in this episode. The history I'm about to give you is not every last bit of information out there. I'm giving you the overall arc and the major events of tarot's timeline. There just isn't time to do an all-inclusive history of the tarot. I've actually, in a way, become fascinated by the subject of tarot's history, and I hope that you will find the evolution of tarot as interesting as I do. I also need to apologize in advance for any mispronunciations I may make of names and places in this episode. There are a lot of Italian and French names, and I will try my best to pronounce them as close to correctly as I can, but I do not speak either language. Let's start by dispelling the thought that tarot is an ancient divinatory practice. The word ancient means belonging to the very distant past and no longer in existence. I do still see, very frequently I might add, people advertising classes on learning the ancient art of tarot, or ads for readings where the ancient art of tarot will answer all of your questions. Any way you slice it, you will find out in this episode that tarot is not ancient. And as you'll see as we move along, tarot as a tool for divination is actually most likely younger or very close to the same age as the United States of America, which clearly is not ancient. Even though I've given you that little spoiler, I'm going to try to keep things as linear as possible so that you can get the clearest picture I can give you of how tarot, as we know it today, came to be. Just as an aside, I want to mention that just because a reader or tarot teacher uses the adjective ancient to describe tarot doesn't automatically mean that I consider them a bad reader or teacher or a scammer or a fraud or anything like that. They may just still be misinformed or uneducated, as so many of us in the tarot community were at one point in time. But if someone uses the adjective of ancient to describe tarot, at this point in time, I do consider it cause for pause, and I proceed with a lot of caution in regard to that person. Back in the mid-90s, it was hard to find accurate information. So back then, if somebody was misinformed and said tarot was ancient, you could understand that maybe they didn't have access to good information. But today, in 2024, you can easily find better, if not really good, information on the actual legitimate history of the contemporary art of tarot. So there really isn't a good excuse for those who still spread misinformation and myths about the history of tarot. There really isn't an excuse for anyone to claim that tarot is from Egypt or that the Romani invented the tarot. We know better, and we need to do better as a community. Let's start with a little info on the origin of playing cards, because tarot is an evolution of them. The origin of playing cards is typically attributed to the Arabics. Now, the Chinese are credited with the invention of paper cards, but playing cards as we know them today are traced back to Arabic origin. So the Chinese invented the method of creating the paper, the actual physical cards, but the Arabics are the ones who created the system that would be the foundation for what we consider playing cards today. The oldest deck of playing cards we know of is the Mamluk deck. This deck was created by the Mamluks, who were warrior slaves that had been imported into Egypt. Now, while the Mamluks fought for the Muslims in Egypt, remember, they were slaves brought into Egypt from elsewhere in the Middle East. They were actually a group of many different races, and it has been speculated that they were predominantly Christian. The information I found said that the Mamluks were brought to Egypt in 2050 CE. The Mamluk deck has 4 suits, similar to our modern playing cards, and it has court cards. The court cards were the king, the governor, the viceroy, and the second viceroy. Today, we are used to seeing people depicted on the court cards, but that was not the case with the Mamluk deck. It has been said that the lack of portraits on these cards is due to the Muslim ban on human portrayals in art, but this theory has some holes as far as I and some scholars are concerned. First, Islam only bans the portrayal of people in religious context, not art as a whole. Second, I really don't think we can say the Mamluks were Muslims. They served and fought for Muslim causes because they had to. They were slaves that had to do as they were told. They were said to be a group of such varied races and cultures that I don't know that we can pin them down as followers of any one religion. Even if some scholars lean towards labeling them as Christians, I don't know that we can really make that assertion. At any rate, we do know that the Mamluk deck did exist, and that by 1379 CE, we begin to see playing cards being used in Northern Europe and throughout other places in Europe. The next evolution towards tarot is really where we attribute tarot as starting, and that's with a trick-taking card game called Tarocchi in Italy. While the invention of playing cards was most likely not of European origin, the trumps that we associate with tarot definitely were of European origin. We find documentation of Tarocchi in writings in 1442 and a fresco in Milan titled The Tarocchi Players that is also from the 15th century. Tarocchi started as a status symbol because only the nobles could afford to have a deck commissioned. While we don't know who commissioned the first deck or who painted the first one, it is pretty reasonable speculation given the place and time period that the creator or creators of Tarocchi were Christians. I mention the believed religion of the creators and first players for two reasons. First, because of the eventual tension between certain religions and tarot that would come as Tarocchi gained in popularity. Secondly, because it explains the where and the why of some of the symbology you see in tarot. Eventually, Tarocchi became available to peasants as well, and the game became highly associated with gambling among the rich and the poor. 1491 brings us the Solabusca Tarot, which is important for a couple of reasons. First, it is the earliest known 78 card deck, which for those who don't know, modern tarot decks are 78 cards. You do occasionally find tarot decks that add a card or two. The Tarot de la Nuit and the Ethereal Visions Tarot are two such decks. But in order for a deck to be a tarot deck, it must be a 78 card deck set up in a specific structure. And I hadn't initially planned on talking about this in this episode, but I feel like since I just mentioned that tarot is a deck set up in a specific structure, maybe I should really quickly go over what that structure is. So a tarot deck has 78 cards. There are 22 major arcana cards, and those are the cards that we very much think of when we think tarot. The Lovers, the Devil, Death, the Tower, the Magician, the Chariot, the Star, etc. You get the idea. Then the other 56 cards are called the minor arcana, and they have the four suits. Traditionally, they are the pentacles, the swords, the wands, and the cups. Those cards are numbered ace through 10 in each suit, and then each suit has four court cards: the page, the knight, the queen, and the king. Now, you will see some variations when it comes to titles in different tarot decks to fit their theme or what have you. Sometimes wands are called staves. Sometimes pentacles are called coins. In the Thoth deck, I believe it's the pages are princesses. So there are some variations from deck to deck, but every tarot deck has to have 78 cards, 22 major arcana, 56 minor arcana. The minor arcana are broken into four suits, numbered ace through 10, and then having four court cards for each suit. So the suits and the court cards are very much like the Mamluk deck, with the Italians adding the majors or the trump cards to the deck in Italy, but we don't have all 78 cards until the Solabusca Tarot. Art historian and curator of the British Museum in the early 20th century, Arthur Mager Hind, was able to date the deck and clearly tie it to Venice, Italy. He believed that a miniaturist from Ferrara named Mattia Serrati da Casandola was the creator of the deck, but this has not been proven. Secondly, the Solabusca heavily influenced the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which is perhaps the most widely known tarot deck, at least here in America. Even before I started reading tarot, I had heard the propaganda from the Christian churches extolling the evils of tarot, and I always wondered where it had come from. Why did the church hate tarot so much? The earliest references I found was in early 17th century Italy, when a Dominican preacher, whose name I could not find, gave what was called, and I quote, a fiery sermon, where he referred to tarot as, and I quote, the Devil's Picture Book, and condemned the playing of tarot. I just have to say, as a side note, I love that title, and sometimes, just to be a bit cheeky, I will refer to tarot as the Devil's Picture Book because that just makes me laugh. His issue, from what I have read, was not with tarot as a tool of divination, because it wasn't a divinatory tool yet, but was actually the fact that the card game was a form of gambling. Others in the church followed his lead, also condemning the deck on the grounds of gambling. By the mid-17th century, tarot has arrived in southern France and became quite popular. The French occultists and psychics really did a lot for and to tarot. Tarot had pretty much died out in popularity by now in Italy, but the French were using their version of the deck, named for the Marseille region of France, where it originated. Unlike the Solabusca tarot, where both the majors and minors were fully illustrated, Marseille-style decks had illustrated majors, but the minors were pips. The earliest surviving Marseille deck is dated to 1650, and these decks remained popular in France through the 1800s. There are readers today who still read with Marseille-style decks. I only have one Marseille deck, but that's because I prefer fully illustrated tarot decks. But that doesn't mean these decks aren't beautiful and accurate. We just all have our preferences. Notice that so far, we've only talked about tarot being used as a card game, and that I said earlier that tarot as a divination tool isn't nearly as old as some people would lead you to believe. I've heard the myth that the Romani have been using cards, both playing and tarot cards, for divination for centuries, but there isn't a single shred of evidence to support this. We also know with certainty that the Romani didn't invent the tarot either, so we can squash that myth, which some still attempt to use in order to gatekeep tarot and try to claim that it is a closed practice, when it is not. Sir Michael Dumet, historian of card games and professor of logic at Oxford, has traced the origin of cartomancy, which is a broad term for using cards for any kind of divination. According to him, the practice of cartomancy began around 1760 CE, and tarot being used for divination purposes didn't begin until around 1780. Now, I will tell you, I do believe his findings because in researching tarot and other forms of cartomancy, the oldest sources I can find that lay out using cards for cartomancy come from that time period. You will find a couple references to things out there that say differently, but when I have tried to track down those supposed older sources, I have always come up empty-handed. If Dumet is correct, then it took around 300 years for tarot to evolve from a card game into a divination tool. Now, I did mention those 17th century French psychics and occultists. Between then and the late 18th century, they were using the cards for esoteric and occult purposes. Maybe a little bit of divining went on, but not anything like what we think of when we think of tarot reading today. They had other things in mind for tarot. Whether you try to date tarot's beginning at the introduction of tarot in the 15th century Italy, or with the beginning of its use as a divination tool in the late 18th century, it really can't be called an ancient art. In the grand scheme of things, tarot is pretty new, especially as we know it today. Just to do the math for you, if we take the 1768 date for the start of tarot as a divination tool, that means we've only been using tarot for divination for about 256 years. While that is a long time, it certainly is not ancient. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned the Egyptian origin myth of the tarot. Historians have agreed that there is zero evidence to support this origin theory, but it had to come from somewhere, right? The beginning of this origin myth is believed to stem from a French clergyman named Antoine Coeur de Guesclin in 1781. Apparently, Guesclin was watching some women play the tarot card game, so the French version of tarot, and without any scholarly research or evidence, just decided in that moment in time as he's watching them that tarot had an Egyptian origin. While the language and hieroglyphs of the Egyptians hadn't even been cracked yet, the Rosetta Stone still wouldn't be found until 1799. He decided that the proof, if you will, of his theory was in the game's name, and he claimed that the French word tarot wasn't French at all, but was the combination of two Egyptian words. Tarot is actually the French derivation of the word tarot. While we don't know for absolute certain that Gebelin was the very first person to suggest the Egyptian origin myth, there is evidence to support that he was the one responsible, or at least one of the earliest, loudest advocates for that theory. Why, of all things, did Gebelin and others cue on ancient Egypt for a proposed origin of the tarot? During this time, ancient Egypt was the it topic. Everybody was obsessed with Egypt. Many believed that translating the hieroglyphs and learning more about ancient Egypt would unlock all manner of knowledge. Occultists ran with Gebelin's assertions, even though there was nothing to back up what he said other than sheer romanticism for mummies, pyramids, and mysteries. In 1783, Jean-Baptiste Eliot, aka Attia, devised a method of tarot divination and assigned meanings to each of the 78 cards. The first to assign divinatory meanings to all 78 cards in the deck. He is most commonly referred to by his pseudonym Attia, which is just his surname spelled backwards. I have found that many of the French occultists and psychics used pseudonyms, though I did not find a expressly stated reason as to why. We can make an educated guess, though, as to why these people might have used pseudonyms. Attia is also the first person known to have made a living by reading tarot cards, but that is not his only distinction. He created the first Egyptian, if you will, tarot deck, known as the Grand Attia, or I've also seen it called the Grand Attia Egyptian Gypsies Tarot. There is just so much wrong with that title that it hurts my head, but I promise I will not let myself get sidetracked by that tangent at this moment. He believed that his deck corrected mistakes that those before him had made to the tarot prior to his addition. The first society for tarot, as a form of cartomancy, was started by Attia, which he named the Literary Society of Free Associates of the Interpreters of the Book of Thoth. Now, it was actually named in French, and I have the big long French name, and I will tell you, I did look up how to pronounce all of it. But for my brain to try to retain all of that in French when I don't speak French, I figured it was better just for me to say the name in English. This guy had some interesting beliefs on the tarot. Among them, besides the fact that he bought into the ancient Egyptian origin myth, is that the tarot is a book of eternal medicine, that it is an account of the creation of the world, and that the first deck was imprinted on leaves of gold. While his ideas might be considered interesting, they were not in any way accurate. It makes me really curious to know what kind of readings he gave to his clients. I really wish that there was some way that I could go back in time and be a fly on the wall while he was giving someone a tarot reading, because he had such an interesting take on the tarot that I really would love to see what a reading of his was like. There are not a lot of women involved in the history of tarot until we get to the 20th century. And even then, women don't seem to be really involved until the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Due to this, I feel it's worth noting another early famous cartomancer who used a combination of playing cards, some of Atiya's Egyptian tarot cards, and some other fortune cards. Marie-Anne Lenormand was a French orphan born in 1772. She was pretty much the first cartomancer to the stars. So whereas Atiya was the first one that we know of to read cards professionally, she was the first one to read for the upper class and the famous. She read for many notable higher-ups in French society of the time, including the Empress Josephine and Napoleon himself. While she was known to incorporate tarot into her readings, her legacy is really the Lenormand system of cartomancy, which is interesting because she didn't read the Lenormand system, at least not as we know it today. Savvy businessmen created decks based off of a German system of cartomancy that they then published somewhat in her honor and bearing her name after her death in 1843. They were more capitalizing off of her name and fame and the beginnings of the modern spiritualist movement. While I don't know how much we can say she directly contributed to the history of tarot, she was definitely influential to the art of cartomancy as a whole and is one of the very few notable early women in the art, and I felt she deserved a mention for that. It's funny because now we think of tarot as a very female-dominated field, but for most of its history, men dominated tarot. I keep mentioning that French psychics and occultists did a lot in moving tarot towards what we know today, and I kind of have to keep repeating that because it was so true. One of these men was Alphonse Louis Constant, better known as Eliphas Levi. Again, a French occultist with a pseudonym. This name change was an attempt by Alphonse to Hebrewize his name. He was a ceremonial magician, occult author, and radical socialist. Levi's book, Dogma and Ritual of Transcendental Magic, published in 1856, became the predominant influence on European esoteric and magical teachings. His book and method was a mix of ceremonial magic, Kabbalah, alchemy, and tarot. If you aren't familiar with Kabbalah, it is the Jewish mystical interpretation of the Bible, and as I do not study it, use it, practice it, anything like that, that is where I will leave that topic. Once the teachings made their way to England, they were adopted by the Order of the Golden Dawn with some modifications. To his fans, Levi is considered, quote, one of the key founders of the 20th century revival of magic, end quote. His writings even became very popular amongst spiritualists, which I find really surprising because he heavily criticized the spiritualists quite openly. The modern spiritualist movement is often dated as starting in New York in 1848 with the Fox sisters claiming to be able to communicate with spirits through knocking sounds. But we'll talk about the spiritualist movement and its ramifications for tarot a little more when we get to the 20th century. Levi didn't just incorporate tarot into his practice. He made some changes to it in order to make tarot fit his own personal narrative and system, which is what we've seen men do again and again through tarot's history. They take the preceding decks and then create their own, forcing tarot to fit their own narratives and agendas. It was Levi who associated each of the trumps, the major cards, with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet and placed each of the 78 cards on the Kabbalah's Tree of Life. He very much was the one who intertwined Kabbalah and tarot. He also perpetuated the Egyptian origin myth and claimed that he was restoring the, quote, Egyptian purity, end quote, of the cards. This meant that he inserted a lot of Egyptian symbols into the artwork as well as other symbols he felt belonged there. Here are just a few of the examples of things Eliphas added to the tarot. The sphinxes pulling the chariot, the high priestess wearing the horns of Isis, the square and triangle on temperance, the empress with her feet on the crescent moon, and Baphomet as the devil. I personally have never been really familiar with the figure of Baphomet. The devil was not one of my favorite cards in my early years as a reader, and it is one of the cards that gave me a hard time back then. To be perfectly honest, I'm quite happy when deck creators choose to replace it with another card. In researching the history of tarot, I read that the name Baphomet is the French bastardization of the name Muhammad, and I'm sure there's a lot we could delve into with that. But, moving on. It's the French bastardization of the name Muhammad, and that the figure is most notably associated with the trials of the Knights Templar. This explains a great deal as to why I had a hard time with this particular card. I have my own understanding and interpretation of this card now, but learning about how it developed helped me to get to that point. It's also interesting to note that while Levi's depiction of Baphomet, which he drew himself and is the most prevalent depiction of Baphomet that we see today, it does not match any other earlier accounts of descriptions of Baphomet. Eliphas combines several separate elements to create an aesthetic and a symbology that fit his agenda. He is also credited as the first to say that the inverted pentagram is evil. So thanks for that crockable there, Levi. Now we start to get into the parts of tarot history that are more recognizable to us today. Probably the most iconic tarot deck and the one recognizable by the most people, whether they read tarot or not, is the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, though it wasn't always called that. Arthur Edward Waite was born in 1857 New York, but lived and died in England, where he was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn. Like his contemporaries, he was influenced by the works of Eliphas Levi. But he disagreed with him when it came to some of the symbols, etc. in tarot. Waite would set out to create his own deck, one which is arguably the most well-known to this day. But yet again, we see a man setting out to correct or improve previous decks based on his own agenda and narrative. Waite enlisted fellow Golden Dawn member and artist Pamela Colman Smith, also known as Pixie, to illustrate the deck under his direction. Now, Pamela, Pixie, was a illustrator by trade, and I think that's important to note. They drew heavily from the Solabusca Tarot and Levi's work. Though I'm not sure how much we can say that Waite drew from Levi's work so much as tried to correct what he saw as wrong with Levi's deck as well as others. The deck was originally published in 1909 as the Rider-Waite Tarot, and Waite's companion book titled The Pictorial Key to the Tarot was published in 1911. What's in a name? The publisher of the deck was the Rider Company, and Waite was credited as the creator of the deck, and that's how the original name was formed, Rider-Waite. In more recent times, people have really been vocal about the fact that Pixie didn't get her share of the credit for this historic deck, and now the tarot community generally calls the deck the Rider-Waite-Smith deck to give her the credit they feel she is due. While I fully support giving artists the credit for the work they do on tarot decks, I'm not sure how she would feel about this. I've read accounts that her time working on the deck was something that she considered a small and not very significant part of her life. Now, none of us can say for sure if that's true. She's not here for us to interview, but I have read several accounts that state that. No matter how Waite or Pamela felt about the deck in the end, it is historically a very important piece of tarot history. Many of the decks on the market today are formatted either in the Rider-Waite-Smith system specifically or mirror it very closely. From the accounts that I have read, I don't know that Pixie was granted a lot of artistic license in the images on the cards. Waite had very specific ideas about what symbols, colors, etc. he wanted in the deck and why. If you read tarot, you may know that in Rider-Waite-Smith decks, the 8th card in the majors is Strength, and the 11th card is Justice. In previous decks, it was actually the other way around, and some decks today have gone back to the pre-Rider-Waite-Smith ordering, with Justice as the 8th major and Strength as the 11th. Waite changed their placement in his deck to make them fit with the astrological associations he was adding into the cards. Another big change he made was the Lover's card. In older versions of the tarot, there were 3 people on this card, and its meaning, or one of its meanings, was choices. Then it evolved to a clergyman with a couple. Waite is the one who made a change to it being Adam and Eve with an angel above them. And I always just find it so amusing that the tarot has so much Abrahamic symbology in it, at least with the Rider-Waite-Smith and some of the more traditional decks, the Marseille deck. There's tons of Christian influence, and yet the church's official position is anti-tarot when it fills so much of it. Now we've gotten to one of, if not the most controversial person in tarot history, Aleister Crowley. Crowley, born Edward Alexander Crowley, was a ceremonial magician, occultist, and short-time member of the Order of the Golden Dawn. People either tend to love Crowley or hate him. I seem to be one of the few that doesn't have super strong feelings on the subject, though I do honestly lean more towards disliking him, because from what I have read about him as a person, he does not come across as a good human being or an influence that I would recommend anyone should attempt to emulate. In fact, reading of his exploits, he seems like he was a pretty shitty guy. After leaving the Golden Dawn on bad terms, he founded the religion of Thelema and began to work on his own tarot system. Yet another tarot creator obsessed with Egypt. He was running a con while living there in Egypt and working on his book, which is the Book of Thoth. This book describes how to use his tarot deck, known as the Thoth deck, and was first published in 1944. And I do believe, if I remember correctly, he actually wanted to publish around the same time as Waite, but there was delay after delay after delay. His deck incorporates influences and mystical practices from many unrelated cultures. There are people today who do use the Thoth deck for readings, and it is still in print. You can get many different versions of it, though it is not nearly as popular as the Rider-Waite-Smith or decks made to follow the Rider-Waite-Smith system. Some readers, though, refuse to have anything to do with it because of their feelings towards Aleister Crowley. Tarot readers today, here in the United States, have to deal with certain legal issues when it comes to being able to read tarot, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the history of laws concerning tarot in an episode on the history of tarot. Each state, and sometimes individual municipalities here in the United States, have laws or ordinances regulating or prohibiting any form of divination. These laws stem from the time of the modern spiritualist movement that I mentioned earlier. The movement began, as I mentioned, in 1848 with the Fox sisters. The problem is that there were many frauds and fakes that used the spiritualist movement, which is a sincere spiritual movement, to rip off a great many people. I'm not saying that spiritualists are the frauds or the fakes. I want to make that clear. But their movement was hijacked and used by con artists to make a profit, often from the grieving. Among the con artists were the girls who sparked the movement, the Fox sisters. Now, the sisters weren't setting out to start a spiritual movement, to be clear on that. But their prank, I guess we could call it, sparked something in people. And that is, the precipitating incident, if you will, for the beginning of the spiritualist movement. In 1888, Margaret Fox would admit that she and her sister had committed fraud and that they were responsible for the spirit knocking the whole time. In fact, she even went into explaining to how they had supposedly done it. This is still controversial, though, as the sisters would admit to everything being a hoax and then recant their admission, then make the admission again, and so on a few times before their passings. And to be perfectly honest, I think at the time of each of their passings, one sister said it was a hoax and one sister said it was real. So one was saying, nope, we made it all up. And one, if the account that I read is correct, right? I wasn't there when she passed, but from the accounts that I've read, one sister came out and said that it was all a hoax, and at the time of her passing, that was what she maintained. The other sister had gone back and forth between it was a hoax, no it wasn't, it was a hoax, no it wasn't, and then before her passing, she was maintaining that no, it was all real. So there's a lot of controversy around the Fox sisters. The Roman Catholic Church condemned spiritualism in 1890, and the Anglican Church followed suit in 1920. The problem of con artists abusing and misusing the modern spiritualist movement was so bad that the United States created the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951. This act would remain in place until it was finally repealed on the federal level in April of 2008, because the federal government said that anyone who felt they had been defrauded by mediums or tarot readers, etc., are sufficiently protected under modern consumer protection laws on the federal level, and therefore there was no need for a fraud act specific to mediums. However, the state and municipal laws regarding tarot were by and large left on the books. If you are thinking of reading tarot for profit, or even barter, and in some cases even for free, make sure to check your state and local laws first. In Pennsylvania, where I am originally from, they have very strict laws. The laws in Pennsylvania not only cover reading tarot for cash, but for any type of gain at all. So, if you are an American, yes, most states have laws restricting or prohibiting the reading of tarot, and you've ever come to wonder why our government has bothered with creating laws restricting the reading of tarot as a profession, now you know it is because of the people who took advantage of, hijacked, abused, misused, and disrespected the modern spiritualist movement. Despite the laws restricting tarot and the like, tarot got a big boost in popularity in 1959, when University Books mass-printed the Rider-Waite-Smith and Waite's book, making them much more accessible to the everyday person. You can still easily purchase Waite's book today, and the Rider-Waite-Smith is ubiquitous. Then, after that, an even bigger boost came in 1960 or 61, depending on what source you read, with Eden Gray's book, Tarot Revealed, a modern guide to reading the tarot cards. This book is out of print as far as I can tell, but you can still purchase used copies, and the price I've seen on these isn't too bad. I've read Waite's book, and from a historical perspective, it's not bad to have read it once, to see what he had to say, what his agenda was, what his narrative was. But from a practical perspective, in my everyday reading practice and how I see other people react and respond to it, that book oftentimes discourages people from reading tarot rather than inspiring them to read tarot. Let's just say if I had the chance to sit at a coffee shop and discuss tarot over a latte with Waite, I'd probably also need bail money. I openly admit, I am not a fan. Gray's book was much more relatable, or at least that's how it is talked about. It's much more relatable for the everyday person and wasn't uptight about a right and wrong way to read the tarot, because Waite definitely had ideas on what was right and wrong when it came to reading the tarot. Her book really opened up tarot to an audience beyond occultists and societies like the Order of the Golden Dawn. Just some fun tidbits about Eden, because I feel like we really need to do more showcasing of the women in tarot's history. She was an American actress born in 1901. Her birth name was Priscilla Partridge, and she lived until 1999. The deck that ushered in what is called the postmodern era of tarot, which is considered to be from 1971 to today, was The New Tarot, The Tarot for the Aquarian Age by John Cook and Rosalind Sharp in 1968 or 69, again, depending on the source. Their deck was based on their philosophy that you didn't need to memorize meanings of cards in order to read tarot. They believed that the meanings are already in you, in your subconscious, and that the images on the cards unlock those meanings for you. This opened up a much more intuitive way to read the tarot. I wish I could tell you a little more about John and Rosalind, but I haven't found any biographical information for them. If anybody knows of some, please send it my way. The book is out of print, and while you can find some used copies out there, the ones I've seen are exceptionally pricey. Because of this, I have never read this book. From what I've read about it, the book is very new agey, and while it was pivotal for its time and made tarot more accessible, I'm not inclined to believe that I personally would find the price tag for the book worthwhile for me. Today, tarot is very popular and much more mainstream. The church's official position on tarot as a form of gambling and in more recent times a divination tool haven't changed, but I find more acceptance today when I tell a stranger that I read tarot than I did even just 5 or 10 years ago. And when it comes to the church's take on tarot for reasons other than gambling, well, we could do a whole episode just on that debacle because there is a lot to unpack there. I'd also like to do a future episode where we look at some contemporary readers like Pollock, Greer, maybe even Anthony Dawn, just to sort of highlight some of the people who have been spearheading tarot and the advancement of tarot in the last 20 or so years. But those are much more contemporary. We're talking about history, so I feel like that deserves its own episode, so let me know if you're interested in that. Today, there seems to be an endless number of decks you can choose from and all types of reading styles. You don't see nearly as much emphasis anymore on learning to read the right way. But the emphasis is much more on learning to read in a way that is most helpful for you and your querents. Not that there still aren't people out there trying to make everyone do it their way, but it's very much less common. Every deck creator has an agenda and a narrative they are trying to portray with their deck, just like those who helped to shape tarot's history. That's not a bad thing in most cases. In fact, for readers like myself, that's kind of a great thing. I'm fortunate enough to be reading in a time where I'm no longer limited to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck with its symbols and imagery that I have a hard time connecting with. I can choose a deck with a narrative that is more in sync with me and my spirituality and my intuition. At the risk of destroying any romanticism you have about the tarot, the truth of the matter is that it is all made up. We as human beings created the tarot, and the cards only have meaning because we give them meaning. This doesn't diminish their power as a spiritual tool or make them any less accurate. It's just a reminder that tarot is merely a tool, and the real keys to life, the universe, and everything have been in us all along. The cards just help us to access what we already knew the entire time. In this episode, we've looked at a timeline of tarot's history, the important players, the important dates, the important happenings. I'd like to do a future episode where we look at what the purpose was of doing fortune telling or divination readings or working with tarot as the decks evolved, how the attitudes and styles of readings have evolved as well. But this episode is already long enough. So if you are interested in the different viewpoints and the different purposes for reading throughout history and how that's evolved, then let me know and I will start working on that episode. I think it's very interesting, and I think it's exceptionally interesting in our current time because there is a lot of argument in the tarot and divination communities what exactly you should use tarot for and how exactly you should do readings and what readings are ethical and what readings aren't. And it's interesting how those thoughts and ideas and beliefs have changed over time. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to book a reading with me, a Reiki session, mentorship, soul retrieval session, or any of the other services I offer, you can find my website and my Etsy shop on my Linktree, which is in the description of this episode. Just a reminder, I will never message you first to solicit a booking from you. If someone does, then it is a scammer pretending to be me, which happens to all of us tarot readers. So be very careful, my lovelies, and don't fall for them. I will never reach out to you first. Just a reminder also that all archived episodes of Divination Death Witch can be found in a playlist on the Spirit Tarot YouTube channel. So if you're ever looking for past episodes, you can find them there. Until we get to chat again, blessings to you wherever your journey finds you.